Beyond the Sea is the longest episode of Black Mirror Season 6 so far, clocking in at 1 hour and 20 minutes. It certainly doesn't feel that way, as the episode creates an unforgettable story by fusing cutting-edge technology, the past, and some of the most intense human emotions. The episode's lead actors, David Ross and Cliff Stanfield, are Josh Hartnett and Aaron Paul. They have both completed 2 years of a 6-year deep space mission, and their wives and kids are still back on Earth. Here is a breakdown of what transpired at the end of the episode in case you watched it and are still trying to gather your composure. You should only continue watching if you have already seen Beyond the Sea, since there are major spoilers ahead. You continue watching for the majority of the show believing you already know how it will end. David is condemned to a life in space after the horrific murders of his wife and children at the beginning of the episode, and his replica was also obliterated by the cult leader Kappa. In a gesture of goodwill, Cliff's wife Lana, Kate Mara, offers enabling David to use Cliff's duplicate to travel back to Earth and get some fresh air. When David first visits Cliff's country home after accepting the offer, he sobs in Lana's arms. The likelihood of an affair therefore looks high, but Lana instead receives an approach from David after he repeatedly reappears in Cliff's body to finish a painting for the family. Later that day, she tries to explain to Cliff that she doesn't want David to return after he had their son, adding that he is confusing her while inhabiting her husband's body. She pushes him away at this point. Lana makes excuses and leaves the house with her son for the day after Cliff permits David to return for one final time. Cliff discovers David's sketches in his bunker, though, since he is using Cliff's duplicate. All of them feature Lana, and several of them have her posing while naked. Because David said he could only draw from memory, Cliff is upset and begins to wonder if the two are having an affair. Cliff calls David back via an onboard alert and inquires about the drawings, but as David says, he finds Lana attractive. They start to physically fight. David claims that Cliff is unaware of his possessions and that Lana is unappreciated, but Cliff asserts that he is damn well aware of his possessions. When Lana returns home and Eric Cliff confronts her and asks her about posing for David, she admits that even if Cliff's duplicate is present, she still feels lonely because she was locked inside the house and forced to explore on her own. She says, "I wish he had touched me, but he didn't. It briefly seemed as though my spouse had come back and recognized me as real." The couple embraces as they appear to be in silent agreement. David apologizes to Cliff for overstepping the line and claims nothing occurred when they return to the spaceship. Cliff responds by asserting that Lana wasn't interested. Therefore, he knows that. The idea of David coming back to apologize, according to Cliff, makes her vomit, since Lana feels hurt by his visits. Before declaring that Lana is mine for all time, Cliff continues by labeling David arrogant, a snake, and a conman. We next see David, who is obviously unhappy, chop off his long beard and stand over Cliff in his bunker. Then back aboard the ship, David reports that their coolant tube suffered a hit, necessitating Cliff to wear his spacesuit and check on it. Cliff's replica then receives an emergency alert. David then exits the room while dressed and nods in approval. While pursuing the issue in the shadowy reaches of space, Cliff reports to David that everything is fine but receives no response. As David remains silent, he becomes anxious and hurries back to the door, pleading with David to open it for him. When Cliff wonders where he was, David simply replies, "Bathroom," and the door light gradually goes green as he welcomes Cliff back inside. Although Cliff wonders where his tag is as David is carrying the tray with his possessions, David appears harsh and expressionless. David delivers him the item after carefully removing it from his pocket. When Cliff's duplicate awakens back on Earth after running back to his bunker and plugging in his tag, he is startled to see blood all over his hands and splatter all over his head. He moves cautiously into his house, seeing bloody handprints strewn across the walls, and breaks down in tears in the kitchen. The only thing we see is a puddle of blood with Cliff's sobbing next to it, suggesting that the blood is that of Lana and his son, and that David killed them both while using the imitation of Cliff. Everything else is kept off camera. Cliff returns to the ship once he learns what happened to his family. He returns slowly to the space he shares with David in the final scene, which is uncomplicated. David appears to have been crying as Cliff is crying, and is slowly nodding in agreement. As Cliff tears, David, who is seated at the table, kicks out a chair for Cliff and motions for him to take a seat next to him. Lemur by Charles Trennett is playing in the background of the final image of the spacecraft. Although the episode's conclusion definitely leaves some questions unanswered, it is clear what will happen. Cliff's replica is the one that killed his wife and children. Therefore, it's quite likely that he wouldn't be allowed to use it to travel back to Earth, because doing so would put him at risk of being detained or having the replica turned off entirely. Cliff and David are now in the same state of sorrow and isolation, because they are both without families and lack a motive to travel to any replica of Earth. And although it is cruel, it appears like Cliff will have to handle it in a manner similar to how David did when imprisoned.